in the winter of 1847, 17 young women entered the remote St. Margaret's Convent in the hills of western Pennsylvania, eager to dedicate their lives to God. By spring, only 3 remained alive, and they refused to speak of what happened during those dark months behind the convent walls. For over a century, the Catholic Church has kept the official record sealed, but recently discovered letters from the sole surviving nun reveal a horror so disturbing that it challenges everything we thought we knew about religious devotion and human nature. What drove 14 devout women to their deaths in a place meant to be a sanctuary? And why did the Church go to such lengths to bury this story? The answer lies buried in testimony so shocking that even hardened church investigators couldn't bear to make it public. Tonight, we uncover the truth about the nuns who never took their final vows. Before we continue with the story of St. Margaret's Convent, I want to remind you that this channel isn't for everyone, only for the bravest souls who can handle the darkest mysteries hidden in our history. If you're one of those true mystery seekers, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. And I'm curious, where are you listening from tonight? Leave a comment with your state or city because these stories connect us all across the country. Now let's step into the shadows of 1847 and discover what really happened in those Pennsylvania hills. The story begins in an era when America was still finding its religious identity, and the Catholic Church was desperately trying to establish itself in a predominantly Protestant nation. The year 1847 marked a turning point for Catholic communities across America. As waves of Irish immigrants fled the Great Famine, the Church struggled to provide spiritual guidance and shelter for the growing faithful. Pennsylvania, with its tradition of religious tolerance established by the Quakers, had become a refuge for Catholic institutions, but acceptance was far from guaranteed. Protestant communities viewed Catholic convents with suspicion, spreading rumors of secret rituals and forced imprisonment of young women. The anti-Catholic sentiment was particularly strong in western Pennsylvania, where Protestant families had settled generations earlier and viewed the growing Catholic presence as a threat to their way of life. Newspapers regularly published sensational stories about convents, claiming they were prisons where young women were held against their will. The Nothing Party, a political movement dedicated to limiting Catholic influence, had gained significant support in the region, making life difficult for Catholic institutions trying to establish themselves. St. Margaret's Convent stood like a fortress of faith in the rolling hills of Westmoreland County, 30 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. The imposing stone structure, built in 1832 by German craftsmen, rose 3 stories against the gray winter sky. Its Gothic windows seemed to peer down at the valley below, while a bell tower stretched toward heaven like a pointing finger. The building's architecture was deliberately intimidating, designed to inspire awe and reverence in equal measure. Thick limestone walls quarried from local bedrock kept the interior cool in summer and bitter cold in winter. The narrow windows provided little natural light, creating an atmosphere of perpetual twilight that seemed to swallow voices and footsteps. The convent housed the Sisters of Divine Mercy, a strict order that had recently arrived from France, bringing with them old-world traditions that seemed almost medieval to American sensibilities. Unlike the more familiar orders that ran schools and hospitals, the Sisters of Divine Mercy focused exclusively on what they called the perfection of the soul through suffering. They accepted only young women between the ages of 18 and 25, and only those who could demonstrate both exceptional piety and unusual physical resilience. Mother Superior Agatha ruled the convent with an iron fist wrapped in a silk glove. At 53, she carried herself with the dignity of European nobility, speaking English with a heavy French accent that made even simple prayers sound foreign and mysterious. Her pale blue eyes missed nothing, and the younger nuns often whispered that she could see into their souls. Mother Agatha had fled France during the political upheavals of the 1830s, carrying with her a collection of religious artifacts and manuscripts that she claimed dated back to the early Christian Church. She viewed America as a spiritual wasteland that needed to be cultivated with rigid discipline and unwavering faith. The Mother Superior's background was shrouded in mystery. She claimed to have served in convents across Europe. But when Bishop Patrick O'Malley of Pittsburgh had requested references from French religious authorities, he received only vague responses about administrative changes and relocated personnel. What was clear was that Mother Agatha possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of Catholic doctrine and an unshakable conviction that modern religious practices had become too soft, too accommodating to human weakness. The convent's daily routine was unforgiving by design. The sisters rose at 4 in the morning for matins, their bare feet touching cold stone floors as they made their way to the chapel by candlelight. Breakfast consisted of thin garl and stale bread eaten in complete silence, while Mother Agatha read passages from obscure theological texts. The day was filled with hours of silent prayer, backbreaking labor in the gardens and kitchens, and study of religious manuscripts written in Latin and French. Communication was limited to essential matters, and laughter was considered a sign of spiritual weakness that required immediate correction through extended periods of solitary prayer. The novices, young women preparing to take their final vows, faced an even stricter regimen. They were required to prove their dedication through increasingly demanding acts of penance and self-denial. Simple meals became fasting. Comfortable sleeping arrangements became nights spent kneeling on stone floors. Private prayer became public confession of even thesmalist doubts or impure thoughts. Mother Agatha explained that this process was necessary to strip away the corrupting influences of the outside world and prepare the soul for complete union with the divine. Sister Catherine Murphy, barely 21, had arrived at St. Margaret's in the fall of 1846, with dreams of serving the poor and spreading God's love. The daughter of Irish immigrants, she had grown up in Theslums of Philadelphia, where she witnessed firsthand the suffering of her people. Her father, Thomas Murphy, had been a dock worker who died of consumption when Catherine was 16. Her mother, bridging the gap between two cultures, had taught Catherine to read and write in both English and Gaelic, skills that set her apart from many of her peers. Catherine's faith was her anchor in a world that seemed determined to break the spirits of the poor and immigrant. She had witnessed the charity of the Sisters of Charity, who ran a small clinic in her neighborhood, and their example had inspired her to seek a religious life. But the comfortable warmth of the Philadelphia Sisters' mission bore little resemblance to the harsh reality of St. Margaret's Convent. Catherine's letters to her family, discovered decades later in a trunk in the convent's attic, reveal a young woman of extraordinary compassion and intelligence, but also someone increasingly troubled by what she was witnessing behind the convent walls. The winter of 1847 was particularly brutal throughout Pennsylvania. Snow began falling in November and didn't stop until March, accumulating in drifts that reached the second-story windows of the convent. The isolation was complete. No visitors, no mail, no contact with the outside world beyond the weekly visit from Father Heinrich Metz, an elderly German priest who served the scattered Catholic communities in the region. Even these visits became irregular as the roads became impassable, leaving the convent completely cut off from any outside oversight. Food supplies, already meager by design, dwindled to dangerous levels. The convent's gardens were buried under 6 ft of snow, and the root cellar stores of preserved vegetables began to run low by January. But Mother Agatha refused to reduce the demanding physical labor that was part of the daily routine. If anything, she increased the requirements, explaining that physical hardship was a pathway to spiritual enlightenment. The novices grew thin and pale, their movements becoming sluggish as hunger and cold took their toll. But hunger was the least of the novices' concerns. Mother Agatha had announced in December that this winter would be a special test of their faith, a purification that would separate the truly dedicated from the merely curious. She spoke of ancient traditions, of practices that had been lost in the modern church's accommodation to worldly concerns. The worthy would be elevated to a new level of spiritual understanding, while the unworthy would be redirected to more appropriate paths of service. On the night of December 13, 1847, Sister Catherine was awakened not by the usual morning bell, but by a sound that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life. The soft, desperate sobbing of her roommate, Sister Mary Agnes O'Brien, a girl of 19 who had arrived from Boston just 2 months earlier. When Catherine whispered to ask what was wrong, Mary Agnes grabbed her arm with surprising strength and pulled her close, her breath hot against Catherine's ear. "They're taking us to the chapel," Mary Agnes whispered, her voice trembling with barely controlled terror. "One by one in the middle of the night. And some of us don't come back the same. Sister Elizabeth came back 3 nights ago, but she's not Elizabeth anymore. She doesn't speak, doesn't eat the same food as us, and I saw her drinking something red from a cup that Mother Agatha gave her. Her eyes, Catherine, her eyes reflect light like an animal's." Now, the chapel at St. Margaret's was unlike any Catherine had seen before. Built into the basement of the convent, it was carved directly from the limestone bedrock, creating a cave-like atmosphere that seemed to swallow light and sound. The walls wept moisture constantly, creating strange patterns that seemed to shift and move in the flickering candlelight. Strange symbols were etched into the stone, not the familiar Christian imagery of crosses and saints, but something older, more primitive. Spirals that seemed to draw the eye inward, geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly, and symbols that resembled twisted human forms engaged in acts Catherine couldn't quite identify. Mother Agatha claimed they were ancient Christian symbols from the catacombs of Rome, representations of the earliest martyrs' devotion to their faith. But Sister Catherine, educated in a convent school in Philadelphia by Irish sisters who prided themselves on their knowledge of church history, had never seen anything like them. The symbols seemed to predate Christianity entirely, reaching back to traditions that the early church had supposedly eliminated centuries ago. The chapel's altar was particularly unsettling. Instead of the traditional stone slab, it consisted of a circular depression carved into the living rock surrounded by channels thattled away into darkness. Mother Agatha explained that this design allowed for the proper collection and consecration of offerings, but she never specified what those offerings might be. The altar was stained with something dark that had soaked deep into the porous stone, creating patterns that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. That night, as the clock tower chimed midnight, Mother Agatha appeared at their dormitory door with two senior sisters. Their faces were hidden by heavy veils that covered not just their heads, but their entire features, leaving only dark openings where their eyes should be. They carried candles that seemed to burn with an unusual flame. Not the warm yellow glow of ordinary candles, but a cold blue-white light that cast strange shadows and made familiar objects look alien and threatening. Sister Mary Agnes, Mother Agatha's voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried clearly through the dormitory. It is time for your private examination of faith. You have been chosen for a special honor, one that will test your dedication to our sacred mission. Come with us willingly, and you will be rewarded with understanding beyond your current comprehension. Catherine watched in horror as her roommate was led away, her bare feet making no sound on the cold stone floor. Mary Agnes looked back once, her eyes wide with terror, and Catherine saw her mouth form words that made no sound. "Help me!" The door closed with a finality that seemed to echo through the building like the ceiling of a tomb. Catherine pressed nearer to the thick wooden door, straining to hear any sound from the corridor, but the walls absorbed everything. She waited by the narrow window, watching for any sign of movement in the chapel windows visible from her dormitory, but heavy curtains had been drawn across all the openings. The only light came from an eerie glow that seemed to emanate from the chapel itself, as if the very stones were luminescent. Hours passed. Catherine dozed fitfully, starting awake at every sound, real or imagined. Just before dawn, she heard footsteps in the corridor. Slow, measured steps that didn't quite sound like the quick, nervous pace Mary Agnes normally maintained. The dormitory door opened and a figure entered. In the dimmer dawn light, Catherine could see that it was indeed Mary Agnes, but something was fundamentally different about her. Mary Agnes moved with a fluid grace that seemed unnatural, her usual nervous energy replaced by an almost predatory stillness. When she turned to look at Catherine, her eyes caught the faint light streaming through the window and reflected it back with an intensity that made Catherine's breath catch. For just a moment, she could have sworn she saw something moving in those reflected eyes, something that writhed and twisted like smoke. "Mary Agnes," Catherine whispered, but her roommate didn't respond. Instead, she moved to her bed with that same unnatural grace and lay down fully clothed, staring at the ceiling with those strangely luminous eyes. She remained that way until the morning bell rang, never moving, never blinking, as if she were in some kind of trance. When the other novices began to stir and prepare for morning prayers, Mary Agnes suddenly sat up and looked around as if seeing the dormitory for the first time. But when Catherine tried to speak to her, Mary Agnes responded with confusion and fear, claiming she couldn't remember anything about the night before. She insisted she had slept soundly and had no idea why Catherine was asking such strange questions. But Catherine noticed other changes in her roommate over the following days. Mary Agnes, who had always been a voracious reader of scripture, now seemed unable to focus on religious texts for more than a few minutes at a time. She complained that the words seemed to move on the page, rearranging themselves into patterns that made no sense. During prayers, she would sometimes stop mid-sentence, staring into space as if listening to voices only she could hear. Most disturbing of all, Catherine noticed that Mary Agnes had stopped eating the same meals as the other novices. She would sit at the communal table, moving food around on her plate, but never actually consuming it. Yet, she showed no signs of the weakness and hunger that plagued the other sisters. If anything, she seemed stronger and more energetic than before, her skin taking on an almost luminous quality that made her stand out among the pale, undernourished novices. 3 days after Mary Agnes's midnight visit to the chapel, Catherine was assigned to clean the sacred space as part of her daily duties. As she scrubbed the stone floors and polished the strange altar, she found something that made her blood run cold. Scratched into the stone floor near the back of the chapel, barely visible unless you knew where to look, were words carved with something sharp and precise. "They are not what they seem. The old ways never died here. Trust no one, especially those changed. Find the hidden room behind the altar. The truth is written in the stones. Save yourself while you still can. M.A.O." Catherine recognized Mary Agnes's handwriting from their shared prayer books and study sessions. The letters were fresh, carved recently, and they had been positioned where only someone cleaning the floor would discover them. But the message raised more questions than it answered. What old ways? What hidden room? And most terrifyingly, what had happened to Mary Agnes that she could create such a warning, then seemingly forget she had ever done so? The discovery of Mary Agnes's hidden message transformed Catherine. His understanding of everything that was happening at St. Margaret's Convent, she began to observe her surroundings with the careful attention of someone whose life might depend on, noticing details that others missed. What she discovered over the following weeks painted a picture of an institution that bore little resemblance to any religious house she had ever heard of. The winter deepened, and with it came a routine that Catherine began to recognize as ritualistic in nature. Every few nights, Mother Agatha would appear at the dormitory doors, always at the stroke of midnight, always accompanied by the same 2 veiled sisters whose faces remained hidden even during daylight hours. They would call anime, always in that same whisper that somehow carried clearly through the stone corridors, and the chosen novice would follow without question, as if they had no choice in the matter. Catherine began keeping a careful record, scratching marks into the wooden beam beneath her bed where they wouldn't be noticed during the daily inspections. By the end of January, 8 novices had been called for these midnight examinations. Of those 8, 3 had never returned to the dormitory at all. The others came back changed in ways that became more apparent as the days passed. Sister Elizabeth Hartwell, who'd been called on the 3rd night, returned with an otherworldly pallor and eyes that seemed to hold depths Catherine couldn't fathom. She stopped participating in conversation entirely, responding to direct questions with simple nods or shakes of her head. During communal prayers, she would sometimes begin speaking in a language none of the other novices recognized, not Latin or French, but something that sounded far older and more guttural. Sister Sarah Morton, called a week later, developed an aversion to the crosses and religious imagery that decorated the convent. She would flinch when passing the crucifix in the main corridor, and during chapel services, she positioned herself as far from the altar as possible. When questioned about her behavior, she claimed the symbols caused her physical pain, as if they were burning her skin from a distance. Sister Rebecca Stone, the youngest of the group, at barely 18, returned from her midnight examination with knowledge she couldn't possibly have acquired through normal means. She began speaking fluent Latin during prayers despite having struggled with even basic phrases before her disappearance. More disturbing still, she demonstrated an intimate familiarity with church history and theological debates that would have taken years of study to master. When other novices asked her about this sudden knowledge, she would smile with an expression that seemed far too old for her youthful face and say only that she had been taught by excellent teachers. The remaining novices huddled together during the few moments they were allowed to speak, whispering theories and fears in voices barely above their breathing. Some believed the missing sisters had been sent to other convents as part of their training. Others wondered if they had been so overcome by religious fervor that they'd chosen to become hermits, living in isolation somewhere in the vast convent basement. But Catherine's growing suspicion was far darker than any of these optimistic explanations. She had begun to notice that the senior sisters, who should have been weakened by the same meager diet and harsh conditions that plagued the novices, appeared robust and healthy. Their skin glowed with an almost unnatural vitality, and their eyes held a light that seemed to come from within rather than from any external source. They moved through the corridors with a grace and energy that defied the harsh conditions of their supposed aesthetic lifestyle. More troubling still, Catherine had begun to hear sounds from the basement chapel that defied explanation. During the deepest hours of the night, when the convent should have been silent except for the wind and the settling of old stones, she could detect rhythmic chanting in a language she didn't recognize. The voices were neither purely male nor purely female, but something in between, creating harmonies that seemed to resonate through the stone walls and into her very bones. Accompanied by the chanting, she sometimes heard what sounded like crying, or perhaps singing, so distorted by the stone acoustics that it was impossible to determine which. On one particularly clear night, she distinctly heard what sounded like laughter. Not the joyful sound of human mirth, but something cold and calculated that made her skin crawl. The laughter was accompanied by other sounds she couldn't identify. Rhythmic tapping, the scraping of stone against stone, and something that sounded disturbingly like the dripping of liquid onto the chapel's stone floor. Catherine's investigation led her to explore areas of the convent that were supposedly off-limits to novices. During her assigned cleaning duties, she began to map the building's layout in her mind, noting discrepancies between the structure's external appearance and its internal organization. The convent was larger than it appeared from the outside, with corridors that seemed to extend further into the hillside than the building's footprint would suggest. In the basement where the chapel was located, she discovered a network of tunnels and chambers that didn't appear on any architectural plans she had seen. Some of these spaces were used for practical purposes: storage rooms, wine cellars, and workshops where the sisters prepared medicines and preserved food. But others seemed to serve no obvious function, consisting of empty chambers carved directly from the bedrock, their walls covered with the same strange symbols that decorated the chapel. The most significant discovery came when Catherine found what Mary Agnes's message had referred to as the hidden room behind the altar. During one of her cleaning sessions in the chapel, she noticed that the stones behind the altar didn't quite align properly. Closer inspection revealed that one section of the wall was actually a cleverly concealed door, operated by pressing a sequence of symbols carved into the stone. Inside the hidden chamber, Catherine found a sight that challenged everything she thought she knew about the Sisters of Divine Mercy. The room was filled with books and manuscripts, but these were not the religious texts she expected to find in a convent library. Many were written in languages she didn't recognize. Their pages filled with diagrams and illustrations that depicted practices having nothing to do with Christianity. Some of the manuscripts were clearly ancient, their vellum pages yellow with age and their ink faded to brown. Others appeared more recent, written in fresh ink on quality paper. What they all shared was a focus on what Catherine could only describe as transformation. Detailed instructions for changing the fundamental nature of human beings through ritualistic practices that seemed to combine elements of religion, medicine, and something far darker. One particular manuscript written in French caught Catherine's attention because she could understand portions of it. The text described something called la transformation divine, the divine transformation, a process by which ordinary humans could be elevated to a higher state of existence. But themethids described were horrifying in their clinical detail. The transformation required the systematic breaking down of the subject's original personality and the reconstruction of something new and fundamentally different. The process involved isolation, sensory deprivation, and the gradual introduction of what the text called the sacred substance, a liquid described as having been consecrated through ancient rituals passed down through generations of initiates. Subjects who received this substance gradually lost their original memories and personalities, becoming vessels for something else entirely. The text spoke of sharing consciousness and collective wisdom, but the descriptions read more like accounts of possession than spiritual enlightenment. But the most chilling discovery was a ledger written in Mother Agatha's distinctive handwriting. The book contained detailed records of every young woman who had entered St. Margaret's convent over the past 15 years. Not just the current group of novices, but dozens of others whose names Catherine had never heard mentioned. Each entry included the girl's background, her reasons for seeking religious life, and detailed observations about her physical and mental characteristics. More disturbing still were the notations about each girl's progress through what the ledger called the selection process. Some entries were marked as successfully integrated with dates and descriptions of their new roles within the convent hierarchy. Others were labeled unsuitable for integration, followed by dates and cryptic notes about alternative arrangements. A few entries simply ended with the word consumed and a date with no further explanation. The ledger's most recent entries concerned Catherine's current group of novices. Each girl was described in clinical detail with assessments of her potential for successful transformation. Catherine's own entry made her hands shake as she read it. Highly intelligent, strong-willed, demonstrates troubling independence of thought, potential for integration unclear, may require special handling if resistance develops. Monitor closely for signs of awareness. Catherine realized with growing horror that she had stumbled upon evidence of something far beyond simple religious corruption. This was a systematic operation that had been consuming young women for over a decade, transforming some into something inhuman, while disposing of others in ways the ledger didn't specify. The question that terrified her most was simple. How long did she have before her own name appeared in that final column? The knowledge Catherine had gained from the hidden chamber created a terrible burden. She now understood that St. Margaret's Convent was not merely a place of harsh religious discipline, but something far more sinister. A carefully orchestrated trap designed to ensnare young women seeking spiritual fulfillment, but knowing the truth and acting upon it were two very different things. How could she warn the other novices without revealing how she had acquired her information? And more critically, how could she convince them of something so unbelievable? The answer came when Catherine realized she wasn't the only one who had begun to notice the strange changes in their companions. Sister Margaret O'Brien, a sharp-eyed girl from Boston, whose father was a physician, had been making her own observations about the altered behavior of the novices who had returned from their midnight examinations. During a brief moment, when they were allowed to speak while working in the kitchen, Catherine managed to whisper a single word that carried enormous weight: basement. That night, Margaret slipped away from her dormitory and met Catherine in the storage room adjacent to the kitchen. The space was cramped and cold, filled with sacks of grain and barrels of preserved vegetables, but it provided the privacy they desperately needed. When Catherine showed her excerpts from the manuscript she had discovered and explained what she had learned from Mother Agatha's ledger, Margaret's face went white as parchment. "I knew something was wrong," Margaret whispered, her medical training helping her process the horrifying information more quickly than someone without her background might have. "My roommate, Sister Elizabeth, she came back from one of those midnight visits fundamentally changed. She doesn't eat the food anymore. I've been watching her carefully. She goes through the motions of eating, but she never actually swallows anything. And I've seen her drinking something else. Something thick and dark red that Mother Agatha brings her in a special cup." Margaret's observations added crucial details to Catherine's growing understanding of the situation. As the daughter of a physician, she had been trained to notice changes in human behavior and physiology that others might miss. She had documented a pattern of alterations in the returned novices that went far beyond simple personality changes. "Their body temperature has changed," Margaret explained, her voice barely audible in the cramped storage room. "When we're working together in the kitchen, I've noticed that their skin is cold to the touch, even when the rest of us are warm. From the fire. And their breathing. Sometimes they go for minutes without drawing breath, as if they've forgotten they need to breathe at all." The two young women realized they were not alone in their growing awareness of the situation. Over the next few days, they carefully identified 3 other novices who had noticed the changes, but hadn't understood their significance. Sister Anne Fitzgerald, barely 18 and terrified by what she was witnessing, had been scratching prayers into the walls of her cell, begging for protection from something she couldn't name. Sister Rose McKenna, whose roommate had disappeared entirely the week before, had begun sleeping with a makeshift cross clutched in her hand, claiming it was the only thing that helped her feel safe. Ancestor Clara Walsh, the most intellectually curious of the group, had been conducting her own investigation into the convent's history. Clara's research had uncovered disturbing patterns in the local records. She had gained access to the convent's official correspondence during her duties as Mother Agatha's secretary, and she had noticed discrepancies between the convent's internal records and thereports sent to the bishop in Pittsburgh. According to the official reports, St. Margaret's Convent had successfully trained and ordained dozens of sisters over the past 15 years, sending them to serve in parishes across the country. But Clara had been unable to find any trace of these supposedly ordained sisters in church records. More troubling still, Clara had discovered that several families in the region had inquired about daughters who had entered St. Margaret's Convent, but had never been heard from again. The convent's responses to these inquiries followed a consistent pattern. The young women had supposedly been called to serve in remote missions, or had chosen lives of complete contemplative silence that precluded any contact with the outside world. The families were assured their daughters were happy and fulfilled in their religious vocations, but no proof of this happiness was ever provided. As the 5 remaining unaltered novices began to share information, a picture emerged of an operation that was far more sophisticated and lawn-gunning than any of them had initially suspected. The Sisters of Divine Mercy were not simply a corrupt religious order, but something that had infiltrated the Catholic Church for its own purposes. They had chosen their location carefully, remote enough to avoid regular oversight, but accessible enough to attract young women seeking religious life. Their recruitment methods were subtle but effective, targeting girls from poor families who would not be missed quickly, or those from distant locations whose families would have difficulty investigating their fate. The 5 survivors began to meet secretly, sharing information and developing theories about what was really happening at St. Margaret's Convent. Catherine shared her discoveries from the hidden chamber, while Margaret provided medical insights into the physical changes she'd observed. Clara contributed information about the convent's operations and correspondence, while Anne and Rose shared their observations about the daily routines and behaviors of the senior sisters. Through these discussions, they began to understand that the transformation process was gradual and irreversible. The midnight examinations were not single events, but the beginning of a systematic process of psychological and physical alteration that could take weeks or months to complete. The novices who returned from these sessions were in various stages of transformation, their original personalities slowly being replaced by something else entirely. But perhaps the most disturbing realization was that the senior sisters themselves had once been young women like them. Mother Agatha's ledger contained references to the founding sisters who had established the convent, but older records suggested that these women had originally come to America as novices seeking religious life. Over time, they'd been transformed into the creatures they now served, losing their original identities and becoming agents of whatever force was directing the operation. The 5 young women began to plan their escape, but they quickly realized the magnitude of the challenges they faced. The convent was isolated by miles of wilderness, and the harsh winter conditions made travel on foot virtually impossible. Even if they could reach the outside world, who would believe their story? They had no physical evidence that would convince authorities, and their claims would seem like the fantasies of hysterical young women. Worse still, they began to notice that their secret meetings had not gone undetected. Mother Agatha's behavior toward them became increasingly cold and calculating, and the senior sisters began to watch them with an intensity that suggested they were aware of the growing resistance. The 5 novices realized that time was running out. They would soon be called for their own midnight examinations, and once that happened, they would either be transformed like the others or disappear entirely. The breaking point came on the night of March 10, 1847, when the 5 surviving novices discovered that their secret meetings had been completely exposed. As they gathered in the storage room for what they had planned as a final strategy session, they found Mother Agatha waiting for them, seated calmly on a barrel of grain with her hands folded in her lap. The cold smile on her face told them everything they needed to know about the effectiveness of their supposed secrecy. "My dear children," Mother Agatha's voice carried its usual silk over steel quality. But now Catherine could hear something else beneath the surface, something that sounded almost like amusement. "Did you really believe that your little gatherings had gone unnoticed? This building has been our home for 15 years. We know every stone, every shadow, every whisper that echoes through these halls. We have been watching you, listening to you, learning about your fears and your hopes and your pathetic attempts at resistance." The senior sisters emerged from the shadows where they had been concealed, surrounding the 5 terrified novices with the coordinated precision of predators who had executed this same maneuver many times before. In the flickering candlelight, Catherine could see that their faces were no longer hidden by veils. For the first time, She looked directly at the features of the women who had been directing the convent's activities, and what she saw challenged her understanding of human biology. These were not the faces of middle-aged religious women weathered by years of aesthetic living. The skin was too smooth, too pale, stretched tight over bone structure that seemed subtly wrong, cheekbones too sharp, jaws too angular, eye sockets too deep. Most disturbing of all were their eyes, which reflected the candlelight with an intensity that reminded Catherine of nocturnal animals. When they smiled, their teeth appeared longer and sharper than normal human dentic, and their movements possessed a fluid grace that suggested joints and muscles that operated according to different rules than those governing ordinary human anatomy. "We want you to understand," Mother Agatha continued, rising from her seat with that same unnatural grace, "that we bear you no ill will. What wuffer is not punishment but elevation. You have been chosen not for death, but for transformation into something far superior to your current limited existence. The fear you feel is natural. It is the fear of the caterpillar that must die for the butterfly to be born." Catherine found her voice, though it trembled as she spoke. "What are you? What have you done to the others?" Mother Agatha's smile widened, revealing those unnaturally sharp teeth. "We are what humanity can become when it abandons the limitations imposed by your primitive understanding of existence. Your friends, your roommates, your fellow novices, they have been given the opportunity to transcend their mortal boundaries. Some have embraced this gift willingly. Others required more persuasion. But all have contributed to our great work in one way or another." Margaret stepped forward, her medical training giving her the courage to ask the question they all feared to voice, and those who couldn't be transformed. "What happened to them?" "Nothing is ever wasted," Mother Agatha replied, her tone becoming almost conversational. "Those who proved unsuitable for elevation served other purposes. Their life force, their essence, their vital energy, all of it contributed to sustaining those of us who have already achieved transformation. It is a beautiful circle, really. The weak nourish the strong, the temporary sustains the eternal, the mortal feeds the immortal." The senior sisters began to move closer, forming a tighter circle around the 5 novices. Catherine could smell something emanating from them. Not the expected sense of soap and incense that should have clung to religious women, but something metallic and sweet that made her stomach turn. It was the same smell she had noticed clinging to the returned novices, the scent she had attributed to the herbs used in their mysterious prayers. "The choice before you is simple," Mother Agatha explained, her pale eyes studying each of the young women in turn. "You may join us willingly, retaining some portion of your original consciousness during the transformation process. This path is less traumatic and allows for a smoother integration into our community. Or you may resist, in which case the transformation will be forced upon you, resulting in a less pleasant experience and a more complete erasure of your original personality." Anne began to cry, the sound echoing strangely in the confined space of the storage room. "We just wanted to serve God," she whispered. "We came here to dedicate our lives to helping others." "And so you shall," Mother Agatha assured her, reaching out to stroke Anne's hair with fingers that seemed too long and too pale. "But you will serve powers far older and more magnificent than the pale god worshipped by your ignorant masses. You will become part of something that has existed since before your Christ walked the earth. Something that has hidden within the structures of organized religion for over 1,000 years, feeding on the faith of the innocent and growing stronger with each generation." Just when we thought we'd seen it all, the horror in St. Margaret's Convent intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next in Catherine's desperate fight for survival. Rose found the courage to speak, her voice stronger than the others expected. "You're talking about demons. You're talking about selling our souls." Mother Agatha laughed a sound like breaking glass in the confined space. "Demons, souls, such primitive concepts. We are evolution, child. We are what your species will become when it finally abandons the superstitions that have held it back for millennia. There are no demons here, only beings who have learned to transcend the limitations of mortality. There are no souls being sold, only consciousness being elevated to a higher plane of existence." The senior sisters began to close their circle tighter, and Catherine could see that some of them were carrying objects she hadn't noticed before. Cups made of what appeared to be tarnished silver filled with a thick liquid that seemed to move of its own accord. The smell emanating from these cups was overwhelming, a combination of copper pennies and rotting flowers that made her gag. "The process is quite simple," Mother Agatha explained, her tone taking on the quality of a teacher instructing students. "The sacred substance, which you see before you, has been consecrated through rituals that date back to the earliest days of human civilization. When consumed, it begins the breakdown of your current limitations, preparing your consciousness for integration with our collective wisdom. The transformation takes several days to complete, during which time you will experience visions and sensations beyond anything your current limited perception can imagine." Margaret's medical training kicked in, and she began to back away from the approaching sisters. "That's poison. You're talking about poisoning us." "Poison is such an ugly word," Mother Agatha replied. "Medicine can be poison, and poison can be medicine. It all depends on the dosage and the intended outcome. What we offer transforms rather than destroys, elevates rather than degrades. Your friend Mary Agnes discovered this herself. She fought the process initially, but now she serves willingly and joyfully." Catherine's mind raced as she tried to process what she was hearing. The implications were staggering. If Mother Agatha was telling the truth, then St. Margaret's Convent was not an isolated incident, but part of a vast network of corruption that had infiltrated religious institutions across centuries. How many convents, monasteries, and churches harbored similar secrets? How many young people seeking spiritual fulfillment had instead found only death or transformation into something inhuman? But even more immediately pressing was the question of escape. The 5 novicises were trapped in a small room with no other exits, surrounded by creatures that possessed superhuman strength and coordination. The winter storm outside meant that even if they could somehow fight their way past their captives, they would face death by exposure in the Pennsylvania wilderness. Clara, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, suddenly spoke up with a clarity that surprised everyone. "You're not offering us a choice at all. You're going to transform us whether we agree or not. The only difference is how much of ourselves we get to keep during the process." Mother Agatha nodded approvingly as if Clara Ara had passed some sort of test. "Very good, child. You understand the situation perfectly. Intelligence like yours will be particularly valuable to our collective consciousness. Yes, you will all be transformed, but your attitude toward the process will determine how much of your original personality survives the integration. Willing subjects retain more of their individual memories and characteristics. Resistant subjects become more uniform in their thinking and behavior." The senior sisters raised their cups in unison, the thick liquid within them seeming to pulse with a life of its own. Catherine could see that the substance wasn't entirely liquid. There were darker elements suspended within it that moved independently, like tiny creatures swimming in a crimson sea. "We will begin with the most resistant," Mother Agatha announced, her gaze settling on Catherine. "Sister Catherine Murphy, you have shown the greatest independence of thought and the most troubling tendency toward investigation. You will be the first to experience the full transformation process, serving as an example to the others of what awaits them." Catherine felt a surge of pure terror. But beneath it was something else, a cold, calculating anger that surprised her with its intensity. These creatures had killed or transformed dozens of young women, had corrupted a sacred institution for their own purposes, and had hidden their activities behind the facade of religious devotion. If she was going to die, she would not go quietly. "You made one mistake," Catherine said, her voice growing stronger as she spoke. "You assumed we came here tonight without a plan." Mother Agatha's confident expression flickered for just a moment. "What do you mean?" Catherine smiled, drawing on reserves of courage she didn't know she possessed. "We've been planning this for weeks. We know about the hidden chamber behind the altar. We know about your ledger and your records. And most importantly, we know about the letters." The truth was that Catherine was bluffing desperately, hoping to buy time while she searched for some avenue of escape. But her words had an unexpected effect on the senior sisters, who exchanged glances that suggested genuine concern. "What letters?" Mother Agatha demanded, her composure slipping for the first time. "The letters we've been writing to Bishop Ali in Pittsburgh," Clara added, picking up on Catherine's deception. "Detailed accounts of everything we've observed here, hidden and ready to be delivered if anything happens to us." This was partially true. Clara Ara had indeed been documenting their discoveries, though the letters existed only in rough draft form, hidden in her prayer book. But the effect on their captives was immediate and dramatic. Mother Agatha's face contorted with rage, her carefully maintained human appearance beginning to slip. "Impossible," she hissed. "We monitor all correspondence. Nothing leaves this place without our knowledge." "Father Metz," Margaret said suddenly, inspiration striking her. "The old German priest who visits every week. He's been carrying our letters to the bishop without your knowledge. By now, investigators are probably already on their way." This was a complete fabrication. Father Metz's visits had been suspended since January due to the severe weather. But the lie struck home with devastating effectiveness. Mother Agatha let out a sound that was more animal than human, and the other senior sisters began to move with agitated, jerky motions that suggested they were losing control of their carefully maintained human facades. "You stupid meddling children," Mother Agatha snarled, her voice taking on harmonics that no human throat should have been able to produce. "Do you have any idea what you've done? We have operated in secrecy for decades, building our strength, preparing for the day when we could emerge from the shadows. Your interference threatens everything we have worked to achieve." The senior sisters were transforming before their eyes, their human appearances dissolving like masks made of mist. What emerged was far worse than Catherine's worst nightmares. Creatures that might once have been human, but had been so thoroughly altered that only the faintest traces of their original forms remained. Their limbs were too long and jointed in ways that violated natural anatomy. Their skin had taken on a translucent quality that revealed the movement of dark fluids beneath the surface. Most horrifying of all, their faces had become malleable, shifting between human features and something far more primitive and predatory. What happened next would challenge every assumption Catherine held about divine intervention and the power of faith to overcome evil. As Mother Agatha raised her cup to Catherine's lips, preparing to force the transformation process to begin, the storage room was suddenly filled with a sound that made the ancient stone walls of the convent tremble, the clear, pure tone of church bells ringing across the winter landscape. But these were not the familiar bronze bells of St. Margaret's Tower, which had remained silent throughout the winter months. These bells rang with a clarity and purity that seemed to cut through the air like silver knives, and their sound carried a power that had an immediate and devastating effect on the transformed sisters. They screamed in unison, dropping their cups and clutching their heads as if the sound were causing them physical agony. The effect was so dramatic that Catherine initially believed they were experiencing some form of divine intervention. But the truth, as she would later learn, was both more mundane and more terrifying. The bells belonged to a rescue party led by Bishop Patrick Maley himself, who had indeed received word about the troubling situation at St. Margaret's Convent, not from any letters the novices had written, but from Father Heinrich Metz. The elderly German priest had been growing increasingly concerned about the convent's isolation and the lack of communication from Mother Agatha during the winter months. When the weather finally cleared enough for travel in early March, he had made the dangerous journey to St. Margaret to check on the welfare of the sisters. What he found there had prompted him to ride immediately to Pittsburgh and report his concerns to the bishop. Father Metz had discovered evidence of the convent's true nature in the most mundane way possible by arriving unexpectedly and finding the basement chapel in use during what should have been normal sleeping hours. The sight of the transformed sisters conducting their ritual over the body of a novice who had been reported as successfully transferred to another house had shattered his understanding of what was happening at St. Margaret's. But Father Metz was not an ordinary country priest. He was a member of a secret order within the Catholic Church, an organization that had been founded centuries earlier specifically to identify and eliminate the kind of corruption that had taken root at St. Margaret's Convent. The Church had learned long ago that certain entities found religious institutions to be perfect camouflage for their activities, and it had developed methods for dealing with such infiltrations. Bishop O'Malley and his rescue party had come prepared not just with legal authority, but with knowledge of what they were truly facing. The bells they carried had been blessed with holy water and inscribed with prayers in Latin, designed specifically to disrupt the kind of creatures the sisters had become. The sound waves they produced created a resonance that interfered with whatever supernatural forces sustained the transformed beings. As the bells continued to ring, the senior sisters' carefully maintained human forms began to collapse entirely. What remained was far worse than anything Catherine had imagined. Creatures that seemed to be composed as much of shadow and malevolent energy as of physical matter. They writhed and twisted, their forms shifting and changing as if they couldn't maintain a stable physical structure. Mother Agatha herself proved more resilient than her followers. As her human disguise fell away, she revealed herself to be something that had clearly lived far longer than any mortal creature should. Her true form was a nightmare combination of human and something else entirely, something that might have been beautiful once, but had been corrupted by centuries of feeding on human life force. "You think you have won?" She hissed at the bishop and his men as they entered the storage room, their blessed silver crosses held before them like weapons. "But you understand nothing about what we truly are. We are eternal. We have hidden within your churches for 1,000 years, and we will continue to hide within them for 1,000 more. For every nest you cleanse, 10 more will take root. For every monster you destroy, 20 more will take holy vows. Your faith is our perfect disguise, and your faithful are our perfect prey." Bishop Ali's response revealed a depth of knowledge about such entities that surprised even Catherine. "You are neither eternal nor unique," he said calmly, raising a silver cross that seemed to burn with its own inner light. "You are parasites feeding on the faith of others because you have no power of your own. The church has faced your kind before, and the church will face your kind again. But tonight your feeding ends." The bishop began to speak words in Latin that Catherine recognized as prayers of exorcism. But these were unlike any religious ceremony she had ever witnessed. The Latin phrases were interwoven with words in older languages, creating a rhythmic chant that seemed to resonate with the same power as the blessed bells. The effect in Mother Agatha was immediate and devastating. She began to age visibly, her stolen immortality finally catching up with her as the supernatural forces that sustained her were systematically disrupted. "The sacred substance," Mother Agatha gasped, her voice becoming weaker as her true age began to show. "Without the sacred substance, we cannot maintain our forms. You must understand, we only take what is freely given. These girls came here willingly, seeking religious life. We simply redirected their devotion toward more worthy recipients." "You took their lives," Bishop O'Malley replied, his voice carrying the authority of absolute moral certainty. "You corrupted their faith and consumed their essence. There is nothing sacred about what you have done here, and there will be no mercy for what you have become." The final moments of Mother Agatha's existence were both terrible and strangely pitiful. As the bishop's prayers continued, she began to collapse inward, her stolen immortality unraveling like a tapestry being pulled apart thread by thread. She reached out toward the novices one last time, her expression mixing hatred with something that might have been regret. "We were human once," she whispered, her voice now barely audible. "Long ago we were just like you, young women seeking meaning and purpose in religious life. But we found something older than Christianity, something that promised us power over death itself. We thought we were choosing eternal life, but we chose eternal hunger instead. Remember us not as monsters, but as a warning of what can happen when faith becomes corrupted by desperation." With those words, Mother Agatha crumbled to dust, her centuries of stolen life finally released. The other transformed sisters had already succumbed to the bishop's prayers, their unnatural forms dissolving back into the shadows from which they had emerged. The storage room was suddenly silent, except for the sobbing of the 5 surviving novices and the continued ringing of the blessed bells in the distance. But the horror was not entirely over. As the bishop and his men began to help the survivors, they made a discovery that would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. The novices who had been transformed but not yet fully integrated into the collective consciousness were still alive. But they were trapped in a state between human and monster that might have been worse than death. These young women retained enough of their original personalities to understand what had been done to them. But they had been changed too dramatically to return to normal human life. They begged the bishop to end their suffering, understanding that they could not survive without the sacred substance that had sustained their transformed bodies, but knowing that continuing to consume it would complete their transformation into the same kind of creatures they had just witnessed. The bishop faced an impossible choice. Allow these partially transformed novices to die slowly as their altered bodies failed, or provide them with a quick and merciful death that would spare them further suffering. In the end, he chose mercy, administering the last rites to each of the affected young women before ending their pain with prayers that released their souls from the horror that had trapped them. The aftermath of that March night was both a triumph over evil and a tragedy that would echo through the lives of everyone involved. Of the 17 novices who had entered St. Margaret's Convent, only 5 survived in recognizably human form: Catherine, Margaret, Anne, Rose, and Clara Ara. The other 12 had been either consumed entirely, transformed beyond saving, or reduced to states that made death a mercy rather than a tragedy. Bishop Ali ordered the convent to be thoroughly investigated and then destroyed. The building was dismantled stone by stone. Perhaps the most disturbing discovery was the realization that the corruption had not ended with the destruction of St. Margaret's Convent. Bishop O'Malley's private papers made available to researchers in 1975 included references to 12 other houses that had been cleansed over the following decades, and correspondence with church authorities in Europe suggesting that the problem was international in scope. The bishop had spent the remainder of his career developing protocols for identifying and eliminating such corruption, creating a secret department within the church that continued to operate well into the 20th century. The broader implications of the St. Margaret's incident forced the Catholic Church to confront uncomfortable questions about the vulnerability of religious institutions to infiltration by malevolent forces, the very qualities that made religious life appealing to genuinely faithful individuals: isolation from worldly concerns, absolute obedience to authority, and willingness to sacrifice personal desires for higher purposes, also made religious institutions attractive targets for those who would exploit such devotion for darker purposes. Church authorities developed new protocols for oversight of religious houses, requiring more frequent inspections and better documentation of the fate of novices and postulants. But these measures were implemented quietly without public acknowledgement of the problems they were designed to address. The Church had learned that admitting to such infiltration would damage faith in religious institutions while providing no real benefit to the faithful. Catherine's final letter, written shortly before her death in 1940, contained a warning that resonates with particular force in light of subsequent historical developments. The enemy of faith is not disbelief, but false faith. Evil does not always announce itself with obvious signs of corruption. Sometimes it wears the robes of angels and speaks in the language of salvation. Sometimes it builds institutions that look exactly like places of genuine worship, staffed by people who seem to embody the highest ideals of religious devotion. Trust in God, Catherine continued, but be wary of those who claim to speak for him with absolute authority. Question any religious institution that demands complete isolation from family and friends. Be suspicious of any spiritual teacher who discourages questions or independent thought. The wolves are always among the sheep, and they are always hungry. They've learned to wear our clothing, speak our language, and exploit our noblest impulses for their own dark purposes. The story of St. Margaret's Convent serves as a reminder that the corruption of religious institutions represents one of the most insidious forms of evil, precisely because it exploits humanity's highest aspirations for the lowest purposes. It shows us how those seeking to serve God can become prey for those who would exploit such devotion, and how the very structures designed to protect and nurture faith can become instruments of destruction when corrupted by malevolent influences. The mystery also demonstrates the importance of maintaining healthy skepticism, even within religious contexts, and the need for transparency and accountability in all institutions that claim spiritual authority. The young women who entered St. Margaret's Convent were guilty of nothing more than seeking to dedicate their lives to serving others. Yet they became victims of a corruption that had hidden itself behind the facade of holy devotion. Perhaps most importantly, the story illustrates that the fight against such corruption requires both spiritual conviction and practical vigilance. Bishop Ali and his team succeeded not through prayer alone, but through careful investigation, preparation with appropriate tools and knowledge, and willingness to take decisive action when confronted with evidence of evil. The combination of faith and reason, spiritual authority, and practical wisdom proved to be the key to overcoming forces that had operated in secret for decades. This mystery shows us how the purest intentions can be corrupted by the darkest evil, and how faith itself can become a weapon in the hands of those who would exploit it. The history of St. Margaret's Convent reminds us that not all religious houses are sanctuaries, and not all who take holy vows do so with holy intentions. Sometimes the greatest horrors hide behind the most sacred facades, wearing the masks of angels while serving the purposes of demons. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed about St. Margaret's Convent? Are there other religious institutions that might be hiding similar secrets? Have you ever encountered a religious organization that gave you an uncomfortable feeling, even though you couldn't explain why? Leave your comment below and share your thoughts with our community of mystery seekers. If you enjoyed this tale and want more horror stories like this, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries as much as you do. Remember, the truth is often stranger and more terrifying than fiction. And sometimes the most important stories are the ones that institutions try hardest to keep secret. See you in the next video where we'll explore another dark chapter in America's hidden religious history.